A Note on the Theory of Capitalist States by Colin Barker. In Capital and Class 2, John Holloway and Sol Picciotto, hereafter H&P, published an important contribution to the ongoing debate on the Marxist theory of the state. The note that follows criticizes their article in a couple of points, so I should remark that their argument taken as a whole has very significant merits, in particular its insistence that the capitalist state form cannot be considered separately from the capital relation is exceptionally valuable. To summarize my argument, I suggest there is a very significant weakness in Holloway and Picciotto's article, a weakness which is, however, anything but peculiar to them. Their treatment of the state remains at an appropriate level of abstraction, in particular in that it treats the state as if it existed only in the singular. At an inappropriate level of abstraction, in particular in that it treats the state as if the state existed only in the singular. Capitalism, however, is a world system of states, and the form that the capitalist state takes is the nation-state form. Any discussion, therefore, of the capitalist state form must take account of the state both as an apparatus of class domination and as an apparatus of competition between segments of the bourgeoisie. The failure of Holloway and Picciotto, together with most other Marxist writing on the state, to integrate this perception into their account of the state is connected with a second problem in their article, their insistence on a conceptual separation between, quote, state, end quote, and, quote, capital, end quote, such that state economic intervention seems to be utterly problematic for the capitalist state. Indeed, their account rules out as theoretically impossible, or at least very difficult, what has actually been happening historically, namely the tendency within 20th century capitalism for capital to be organized directly by nation-states, thus taking the form of state capital. Throughout their article, Holloway and Picciotto refer to the, quote, state and the, quote, capitalist state in the singular. One might get the impression from Holloway and Picciotto, as from a mass of other Marxist writing on the state, that capitalism has but one state. Where it is acknowledged that the beast is numerous, the implications of that very concrete fact are not developed at all. In fact, however, the very multiplicity of capitalist states is of great importance to the theory of the capitalist state form. Holloway and Picciotto quote Marx's Capital, Volume 3, quote, the specific economic form in which unpaid surplus labor is pumped out of the direct producers determines the relationship of rulers and ruled. Upon this, however, is founded the entire formation of the economic community which grows up out of the production relations themselves, thereby simultaneously its specific political form, end quote. Now, the central thrust of their argument, with which I agree, is that an adequate theory of the state depends on comprehending the form of the fundamental social relations of production. But if we take Marx seriously, what is the, quote, economic community that grows up out of the production relations themselves, end quote? Taken as a whole, it is the world market, international capitalism, the global system of social relations that has grown up for the first time in human history on the foundation of the capital relation. And if we ask, too, what is the, quote, specific political form, end quote, that this economic community takes, we must answer that it is the set of nation-states that make up the, quote, international political community, end quote, of world capitalism. The nation-state system is a product of capitalist development and is global in scope in just the way that capital as a social relation is. In this light, we should conclude that some of Marx's summary accounts of the relation between capital and the state are at best misleading. Thus, the Communist Manifesto, quote, the modern state is merely the executive committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie, end quote. Take the last phrase, quote, the whole bourgeoisie, end quote. The whole bourgeoisie is an international class like the proletariat, but both are formed as elements of a system of production relations that from their commencement were international in scope. The, quote, common affairs, end quote, of the whole bourgeoisie cannot be managed by any single nation state, yet this is the form that the capitalist state takes. Were this not so, the whole Marxist discussion of imperialism and nationalism would rest on thin air. Holloway and Picciotto suggest correctly that the problem in the Marxist theory of the state is to locate the state in terms of the basic social relations of capitalist production in the capital relation. Quote, the starting point for the analysis of the capitalist state is thus capitalist society, not the state in general, end quote. Capitalist society, we have suggested, is not coterminous with the geographical space occupied by any one nation-state, but is rather the world. The problem is, how do we relate the form of the capitalist state to the society of which it is part and expression? To answer this, we need to understand the capital relation properly. There is a tendency within Marxism to treat the, quote, social relations of production, end quote, as being only the relations formed at the moment and point of production itself. In other words, to identify a mode of production with the immediate relations of exploitation in the productive process itself. This, even if we restrict our discussion to capitalism alone, will not suffice. Marx's critique of bourgeois political economy rested on an analysis of the forms of alienation developed within capitalism, one crucial aspect being the characteristic division of labor within commodity production, in which social production is out of the control of the associated producers. Social relations within commodity production are governed by mutual competition and antagonism among the producers. The materialist critique is aimed at capitalist relations, not simply as alienated exploitative relations, but also and simultaneously as alienated competitive relations. The capital relation is a summary expression for the whole nexus of social relations founded in the production of surplus value, but embodied in the whole circuit of capital. That is, the capital relation is more than the moment of capitalist production. The capital relation is also the other moments of the capital circuit: exchange, realization, price formation, etc. Capital, according to Marx, can only exist as many capitals through the interaction between the many capitals, the principles of capital in general. Capital, according to Marx, can only exist as many capitals through the interaction between the many capitals, the principles of capital in general, are realized. A single universal capital is a contradiction in terms. It is thus characteristic of capitalism that it develops through competition, which competition is the source and expression of the anarchy of capitalist production. Hence, Marx argued the social relations of capital have a dual form, anarchy and despotism. Between the many capitals there is anarchy, within each capital despotism. Each relation, anarchy and despotism, is the condition of the other. Now, if the capital relation has this form, and if the state is an aspect of the capital relation, we might expect to find in the state form elements of this dual determination, as we do. The nation-state, capitalism's state form, is itself both a structure of despotism vis-a-vis its subjects and a structure of competition vis-a-vis its rivals. Its very form expresses the fact that the capitalist state is not something above and separate from the relations of capitalist production, but is itself directly part of those relations. Being anything but a state of the, quote, whole bourgeoisie, end quote, each nation-state is never more than a state of some capitals, of a segment of the whole bourgeoisie. Moreover, to insist on the partial national character of the capitalist state form is not merely a matter of adding on another, quote, factor to the discussion of the state. The dual determination of the state is a permanent presence in all aspects of the state policy and activity. In a capitalist world, it becomes ever more the case that, quote, forgetting, end quote, the international dimension of the capitalist state system puts the theorist in the position of a one-handed violinist. This is not the place to consider how the various nation-states were formed. All we need to note is that each separate nation-state represents an achieved fusion or mobilization of a particular segment of the whole bourgeoisie and other classes in a nation, and a nation formed, moreover, in opposition to other nations. It may well be that the nation-state is a committee for managing the common affairs of its bourgeoisie. However, we define, quote, its bourgeoisie, and, quote, its common affairs, end quote. But it is a structure that is shaped inter alia by that bourgeoisie's competitive struggles with other bourgeoisies, other nations, other capitals. More than an instrument of interclass domination, the modern state is also an instrument of intra-class competition. That competition takes many forms, including trade, transnational investment, imperialist domination, war, diplomacy, etc., and each nation's ability to compete depends on the relative size of the capitals that falls within its orbit. However, we define that orbit. In Holloway and Picciotto's account, however, the state appears one-sidedly as a relation of force directed principally at the working class. Quote, this abstraction of relations of force from the immediate process of production and their necessary location, since class domination must necessarily rest on force, in an instance separate from the individual capitals, constitutes historically and logically the economic and the political as distinct particularized forms of capitalist domination, end quote. The state must appear in this one-sided form, since their whole article is concerned with an abstraction called the state, whose connection with the actual states of the capitalist system is not adequately developed. It is as if we were to try to account for capital and its laws of motion without reference to capital's existence as many capitals. The above quotation illustrates a further problem in Holloway and Picciotto's article. Their argument centers on the idea of the, quote, separation, end quote, of the economic and the political as instances and forms. This, quote, separation, end quote, is a point of principle with them, the concept of, quote, state, end quote, though they argue it is founded in the capital relation, is so separated in their analysis from, quote, capital, that, quote, state and, quote, capital are two opposed notions. In their treatment, the state always stands outside the immediate valorization process and must stand outside. Quote, the state must remain essentially external to the process of accumulation, while the purpose of state action must be to promote the accumulation of capital. The state must, by reason of its form, remain external to that process, end quote. The permanent externality of the state seems to me exceptionally dubious. Given the national form of the capitalist state, there is no, quote, reason of its form, end quote, why it must be thus external to capitalist production and accumulation. Holloway and Picciotto actually come close in the last part of their article to belying their own assumption about the separation of, quote, the, quote, political and the, quote, economic, the, quote, state and, quote, capital. For in their own account, it seems that the, quote, autonomy of state action from the immediate demands of the valorization process, end quote, is itself threatened by the development of capital, even though that autonomy of the state is crucial to their account and is, quote, implicit in the particularization of the state as a distinct form of capitalist domination, end quote. As they note, the British state, quote, intervenes directly in the production process, taking over particular industries and reorganizing the actual process of value creation and exploitation. For Holloway and Picciotto, this kind of development in no way peculiar to Britain, is a fundamental contradiction in the state situation, for it threatens the, quote, generality implicit in its form, end quote. It is exactly this idea that there is, quote, generality implicit in the capitalist state form that I suggest is inadequate. In the sense in which Holloway and Picciotto use the term, capitalism has no organized institution with generality implicit in its form. No state can have this implicit generality, for each state is merely a national state. Within capitalism, the only source of, quote, generality, end quote, consists in the blind laws of motion produced by the movements and interactions of the world's constituent capitals and constituent nation-states. Capitalism in this sense is ungoverned, anarchic. No central institution governs it, only the movement of its parts. Its, quote, generalities, end quote, are only outcomes of anarchic relations between competing capitals. Holloway and Picciotto are not, of course, alone in the view that the, quote, state is not capital, end quote, which is repeated by a number of writers, including Altvatar, or maybe it's Altvatar, I think he's German, Offa, and Habermas. In all cases, for the purpose of analyzing the capitalist state, the bounds of capitalism are treated as coterminous with the national frontiers. That is, rather than seeing capitalist society as a global, quote, social formation, end quote, as a real totality, the world is seen as a set of capitalist societies, a mere agglomeration and not a unity. If we hold firmly to the merely national character of the capitalist state and reject the residual Hegelian idea that the state has some principle of generality implicit in the state's very form, then we can abandon the highest restrictive assumption that, quote, state and, quote, capital are mutually exclusive terms, in which case the discovery that some particular state is becoming more and more directly involved in the valorization process is not in itself an implicit threat to its own logic or anything of the sort, and the kind of developments to which Holloway and Picciotto refer can be accounted for in simpler and altogether more straightforward terms. Consider, for example, the limitations on state action to which Holloway and Picciotto very properly draw attention. These limitations they derive simply from, quote, the state's structural relation to and separation from the immediate process of exploitation, end quote. Yet these limitations also derive surely more simply from the inability of any single nation-state to manage the world economy. In this respect, it is notable that David Yaffa's account, cited by Holloway and Picciotto, of the growth of the state apparatus in terms of the, quote, state's post-war commitment to full employment, end quote, is subject to just the same limitations as Keynesianism, in that it fails to explain how the British or any other state goes about encashing its, quote, commitment to full employment, end quote. Roosevelt in the 1930s seemed to have been as subjectively committed to full employment as were Attlee and Churchill after the war, but he failed. What brought, quote, full employment, end quote, to Western capitalism was not simply the separate, quote, commitments, end quote, of the various national governments, but also, and crucially, the global situations which, while it was the outcome of their various national decisions, was yet more than the sum of the parts. War, we should perhaps remember, restored full employment. In this last section, Holloway and Picciotto do make reference to the phenomenon of the system of capitalist states, but without recognizing the problem it poses for Marxist theory. Their only theorization of the question refers to processes of, quote, convergence, affecting capitalist states through processes of combined and uneven development and interstate imitation. As presented, their, quote, convergence thesis, end quote, is rather dubious. There may well have been elements of, quote, imitation, end quote, in, say, German or Japanese capitalist development in the 19th century, but that imitation occurred not in contemplative isolation, but as a response to pressures exerted on them by the more highly developed capitals of Britain and the United States. The term, quote, imitation, end quote, suggests mere repetition, sameness, and is inappropriate. The German and Japanese, quote, imitations, end quote, were competitive responses whose character dictated to their states more centralized and more, quote, liberal, end quote, political frameworks than existed in the states they were supposedly, quote, imitating, end quote. In any particular branch of capitalist production, some capitals are, quote, ahead and other capitals, quote, behind. The, quote, backward experience the law of value as a coercive force dictating different methods of, quote, catching up from those adopted by the already, quote, advanced capitals. So too with the relations between nation-states. Latecomers and laggards, to succeed, seem to require a greater degree of centralization than their more advanced rivals. If we asked what forces moved the states of Western Europe towards, quote, planning and, quote, nationalization in the present period, our answer would have to include the massive weight of U.S. capital in the world economy. The shift towards national, quote, planning, a marked feature of West European states since the late 1950s, is not an imitative response to the USA, where such processes have gone least far. It is a competitive response, an attempt to mobilize capital resources for competition in the world market. Holloway and Picciotto's article, though, the world market appears only as an occasional afterthought. It is not central to their analysis of the state and its relation to capital, but is just one of the, quote, myriad extraneous circumstances which affect the way the crisis presents itself and may provide escape routes for particular national capitals, end quote. But what is an, quote, escape route, end quote, for one capital is thereby a source of major disruptive pressure for another. Overseas investment by U.S. multinationals like IBM may be, for them, a, quote, escape route, end quote. It's hardly been that for the British domestic computers industry. For Holloway and Picciotto, when Holloway and Picciotto very properly suggest that state intervention does not do away with the anarchy of capitalism, they propose only that the inherent antagonism of the market, where capitals meet as, quote, hostile brothers, end quote, reproduce themselves within the state. They certainly do, but they also reproduce themselves between states, who also meet as, quote, hostile brothers, end quote, whether in the IMF vaults or in the United Nations soup queue. The internal forms assumed by nation-states are shaped not by the domestic class struggle, but also by The internal forms assumed by nation-states are shaped not only by domestic class struggle, but also by the movements of capital on the world stage, a movement that includes themselves. The clear implication of my argument is that there is no abstract theoretical reason why history should not have happened as it has. No reason, that is, why particular nation-states should not have become, quote, capital personified, end quote. Quote, state and, quote, capital can become a unity. Indeed, there are structural aspects to the state's form which suit it to this purpose. It has aspects of a homology of form with every individual capital, being doubly determined by the capital relation as anarchy plus despotism. In most Marxist writings on the state, it is the second determination, the repressive aspect of the state, which is stressed. To that extent, Marxist understanding of the state has tended to continual one-sidedness. When Marx wrote Capital, any tendency to the assimilation of, quote, state and, quote, capital was still in its infancy, yet in ante-during of 1878, Engels was already discussing such developments. In any case, the book Capital itself stands incomplete in two respects vital to the present discussion. The planned volumes on the state and the world market seem never to have been sketched out. What Marx did give us, however, was a clear account of the real historical tendency to concentration and centralization of capital into the joint stock company form and, by mere extension, into the form of, quote, state capital, end quote. The development of state capital is a predominantly 20th century phenomenon, its emergence within world capitalism being characteristically uneven. At one extreme are those states where the means of production are more or less totally centralized into one national state capital, whose development is only comprehensible in terms of their competitive interactions with the rest of world capital, and not simply in terms of their domestic class relations considered in isolation. At another pole stand the nation-states of Western capitalism, around which are formed more or less articulated and enlarged blocks of capital which are either the direct legal property of the states, nationalized industries, etc., or are increasingly effectively state property, given their dependence on the state for investment capital, orders, etc. Capitalism in the last quarter of the 20th century can no longer be described as if, quote, capitalism, end quote, were synonymous with personal private property. The erosion of the apparent neutrality of the state to which Holloway and Picciotto refer is a real erosion. Crucial to it are all those processes, including capital concentration, which press in the direction of a fusion of state and capital. Any such fusion of state and capital, achieved either partially or totally, in no sense abolishes the conditions of capitalist production, nor resolves its contradictions. There are, of course, ideologies of late capitalist development. Any such fusion of state and capital, achieved either partially or totally, in no sense abolishes the conditions of capitalist production, nor resolves its contradictions. There are, of course, ideologues of late capitalist development who conceive that socialism is precisely national single-state capital unified and concentrated into one block, a view of socialism shared, of course, by the bourgeoisie. The view of socialism as equivalent to single-state nationalization, the equation of capitalist nationalization with the Marxist idea of the socialization of production, is widespread still within the workers' movement. That such a conception of socialism should continue with such strength despite all the experiences of the working class in this century, its witness to the under-theorized condition of Marxist state theory. It is seemingly a characteristic of the 57 varieties of reformism that their conception of socialism stops at the local frontier post. If the critique of political economy is to advance its attack on the capitalist state form, we must critically discuss the conceptions of, quote, state and, quote, capital that we've received half unconsciously from previous generations. I'm aware that this note raises more problems than it solves. Nonetheless, today, more than ever, we should remember that the working class has a world to win.